Hello, everybody. We're just going to get started for people on the phone. If you could please make sure your phones are muted if you're joining from the phone. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is a hectic week for everybody right before reading break, so we appreciate the time that you're spending with us here today. So, the Health Research Seminar Series is our monthly series that the Health Research Institute puts on, and with an organizing team that, of course, consists of Rachel Wells and Bree, who do a lot of the organization, but as well as Sarah Gray and Margot Parks and myself, who also help support and encourage researchers to attend and present their work. So our contributions, so we have support for this event by several programs on campus, including the School of Health Sciences, Nursing and Social Work, as well as the Northern Medical Program and the Psychology Program. And then we also receive some financial support from Sun Life Financial that we want to acknowledge as well. If you have any questions about the seminar series, you can contact Bree Loeffler. I was close. I was close. Or if you're interested in presenting, we would be happy to support that as well. Also, on our website, you can access all previous recordings, so of our previous seminar series presentations, as well as view our speaker schedule for the upcoming semester. We do about a year in advance, but you can also view all the past presentations as well. So today, we are fortunate to have Andrea Gingerich, and I'm going to introduce her in 1 minute. She is from the Northern Medical Program. And then March 12th, we have Sarah DeLeo, who will also be presenting. She is also from the Northern Medical Program, who will be sharing her work then. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that presentation as well. And then there are social media accounts that I imagine Bree manages, if you would like to keep up with updates on the Health Research Institute or on our seminar series as well. So I believe that's the end of my slides. Let's see if I can figure this out. I cannot. Tech expert, please.
Maybe. Am I tech expert? On opening. Sorry, guys. It doesn't want to share the. There you go. No, it's not sharing it to the. There we go.
All right. Thank you. We're happy you're here. So I would like to welcome up Dr. Andrea Gingerich. She is an assistant professor in the Northern Medical Program who completed her first year, or is just completing her first year on the tenure track, and we're very lucky to have you here. So she started as a sessional instructor in the fall of 2006, later taking on a role as a research associate and then interim faculty positions. So her teaching focuses on small group learning and preparing others to facilitate small group learning. She has a PhD in health professions from Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and is a scholar with UBC's Center for Health Education Scholarship. So thank you.
Welcome. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for coming, everyone. It's great to have you here. Are they able to hear online now? It looks like it's unmuted, but I'll start kind of a little bit. And I saw a message earlier that said that they could see slides, not audio, so I want. We might have been at that point, so check in a little bit. We're good?
I will check it out.
Okay.
All good.
Okay. So before I get into it all, I'm obligated to say that some of the research findings that I'm presenting today are funded by the Medical Council of Canada and the National Board of Medical Examiners. So those are the national medical licensing boards in North America. And they just want to make it very clear that although they funded this research, they don't endorse it and they don't take responsibility for anything I'm going to say today. And because it's my first time presenting for HRI, I thought I'd introduce myself a little bit more beyond the little blip that you had at the beginning. So in January, Henry Harder was doing this presentation, and he was talking about his Mennonite ancestry. And my last name is easily recognized as being a Mennonite name from southwestern Ontario, which is where my dad was born and raised. And our ancestors came from Germany in the 1700s, settled in Lancaster County. They were fleeing religious persecution, but then there was the American Revolution, and being pacifists, not patriots, didn't work right there. So they came to what would become Waterloo County, settled on the Haldimand Tract on or near. So that was land that had been promised to the Haudenosaunee Six Nations, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy. My family was never part of the religion or part of the community, but my name is recognized, so I thought I'd mention that. On my mother's side, mainly English peasants. They settled a little bit west from Waterloo County, closer to Lake Huron. So that was on the Huron Tract, which was a huge purchase that the British made from the Anishinaabe, who they refer to as the Chippewa, also known as the Ojibwa peoples. And I was born and raised just a few miles away from where those original farms were. At the bottom, some pictures to remind me to say that I've had some really cool jobs over the years, and those influence what I do now, my teaching, my research, and I think you'll see how some of the eclecticness of my background comes up in some of the work that I'm doing. So the one picture, I was a hockey trainer, I'm the one in the dress, and either the summer before or after that, I drove the bookmobile, did children's story hours at villages and towns around the county. I eventually returned to my hometown as a naturopathic doctor and a doula, practiced there with a multidisciplinary clinic before moving to Prince George, and I'm grateful I'm able to live, work, and play on the traditional unceded territory of the Kalaalleq Tene. But now I'm a medical education researcher, and I need to describe what that is a little bit because it's pretty new, and it's a field and not a discipline. So I have a citation here from Jeff Norman, and he described at one time that there have been 3 generations of medical education researchers. So he was one of the ones in the beginning, so that was the 1960s. And it was people who came in, this research needed to be done, and they needed to figure it out. But they didn't necessarily come from backgrounds that aligned all that well with medical education research. So his background was nuclear physics. David Irby had a master's in divinity, and yet they came together and helped make medical education more robust and solve some of the problems and improve curricula. The second generation of researchers, more around the 1980s, came from disciplinary backgrounds and ones that were more relevant to medical education, largely cognitive psychology, but there's also sociology, kinesiology, and so they brought their disciplinary lens to study problems that were important to medical education, like assessment, curricula, learning, transfer of learning, things like this. I'm part of the 3rd generation. So the 3rd generation were trained in medical education. So our degrees tend to be, so my master's is medical education, my PhD is health professions education, and people tend to have a clinical degree as well. So this is a picture from my defense. So these are my 2 parents. So the defense process for Maastricht in the Netherlands is quite different than here. So parents kind of translates to bridesmaid. And traditionally, they would stand up and be at your defense. Their job was to catch you if you fainted, defend on your behalf if you were physically unable to continue. And if a fight broke out, they needed to defend you physically against people who were coming at you. So their role is much more symbolic now, but they can, they're often asked to read from your thesis or some of the other materials that are there. But that's Stephanie Seebach-Sire, who did her master's here. We met when she was doing her master's at UNBC. She's now at Stanford University as faculty. And then Mark Goldschmidt, who is faculty and an internist at Western University, and he happened to defend his PhD the day before mine. So that's a brief history. But even in that history, you can see how there are multiple disciplines, there are multiple methodologies, multiple philosophies from people who come into this field and are working on similar topics, but coming at them in very different ways. So it changes what's allowed in terms of publication and what counts as research. So we have both qualitative and quantitative, the influence of clinical research and shorter papers. You can see that having effects, so that medical education papers look very different than education papers, for example. So that's just to kind of give you a sense of where the research I'm about to talk about is situated, I've tended to study assessment. And assessment is a very popular topic in medical education research. It gets quite a bit of funding. And that's because people notice when our graduates haven't learned all that they've needed to learn. So I don't know if anyone recognizes this infographic. It was very controversial several years ago. So it's showing the leading causes of death in the US, although the numbers are comparable to Canada. And it has heart disease leading the way, followed by cancer. And then, do you know what the third leading cause was? Yep. It was medical error. So controversial in that it shouldn't be that high. Also controversial in that if we were to critique how they did the research now, we probably identify some things that they classified as medical error as us thinking that it probably wasn't medical error, it was something harmful, but not attributing it to that. We're not going to critique it that closely today, but I pointed out because so we start with what they said was medical error, and even in Canada now, the Canadian Patient Safety Institute says like just over every minute, someone in Canada is harmed by unintentional medical error. But we have there's medical error. A lot of it's going to do with the system, so only part of it's going to be attributable to an individual. Of the error that's attributed to individuals, there's only going to be a small number of those that could have been prevented by better assessment or curricula or training, but that's the part that I'm interested in. We use many different modalities of assessment within medical education. So I think the one that comes to mind most quickly is multiple choice exams, which we use a lot of and we rely on them. They're very good at testing knowledge, and they're a big part of our exams throughout all programs and licensing. We also use modalities like portfolio that are better at assessment for learning instead of just assessment of learning, and they help with getting at that identity formation, what it is to become a doctor. But the ones that I'm focused on are rater-based assessment or performance assessment, and we use these all over in medical education. We do use them in things like small group learning, and in our formal structured exams, the OSCEs, which is in more of an artificial environment that is mimicking a real environment. But the rater-based assessment I've been most interested in is in the clinical workplace. So there's so much learning that happens in the workplace. There's so much that we can really only learn when working with patients under real conditions, under the guidance of someone who has done it before. But we're asking a lot of supervisors when they need to assess while they're also doing that. So they're not just assessing, they're supervising the trainee, which involves making sure that they are participating in a way that's safe for them and for the patient. They're supervising in terms of providing teaching and feedback. They're ultimately responsible for patient care, so they have to watch for patient safety. They're part of a healthcare team, so they need to be a good team member. So all of that's happening while we're asking them to do assessments of the trainees. And that complex environment leads to some variable assessments and limits kind of the robustness of how workplace-based assessments are perceived and how they're used. But it's that sort of messy environment that I'm most interested in and where my research has focused. So I've been fascinated by the variability that's in the ratings, in the comments, in this assessment information that we're getting from raters in the workplace. And I have really kind of 4 lines of research that contribute to that right now. The first one was rater cognition, where I'm interested in how supervisors are thinking when they're coming up with their raters and assessment judgments and how that can be contributing to variability. Also assessment language, so not just what we write down, but also how we write it, the different writing styles, and then also conceptualizations of competence and what it is to be a doctor. Those are 2 I'll talk about today, mostly. The other 2 feed in that we've been studying variability in clinical supervision, because how you supervise also seems to impact how you assess trainees. And then we've been looking at professional practice and the different ethical issues that people encounter when they're in northern rural and remote communities, and then how they navigate those differently than how people may navigate them elsewhere. So today I wanted to pick a theme that would be fun and interesting and applicable outside of medical education. So I picked failure to fail because it does run through some of the work that I do. And I don't think it's a secret, but medical education has had a failure to fail problem. So it's not something we brag about, but it's been written about since 2005. This is kind of one of the first big studies that was on failure to fail. And what I mean by that is that underperforming trainees are not assigned ratings that show that they're performing below expectations. Sometimes it also means that they are not given assessment comments that accurately describe how they're performing either. And when this research was done, they identified a few different reasons for this. One was that there just wasn't enough documentation. So if you wanted to be able to intervene or support a trainee, there wasn't enough written down that you could use to support that. There was also that some supervisors or raters didn't know what to write down. So they weren't writing down the right thing because they didn't know what to write down, and then obviously they couldn't collect it, so then there would be the lack of documentation. Some people knew what they needed to write down, but they had been through an appeal before, or they had heard about the messiness of appeals, and they wanted to avoid the stress and the time and effort that went into defending their failing rating at an appeal. So they didn't put down that failing rating. And then finally, some people didn't write down a failing rating that they knew the trainee deserved because they knew there wasn't adequate remediation options. So it seemed unfair to fail someone at that point when there's very little that they could do, that the program had to be able to support the trainee. Now, when I look at these, the first three are really about raters misbehaving, doing things that they shouldn't do, either because they didn't do the training they were supposed to do, or they know what they're supposed to do and they're, for some reason, choosing not to. So because, that is kind of framing most of the failure to fail phenomenon early on, solutions tended to target helping raters to do what they needed to do. So the main solution was to do more, better, longer faculty development and rater training. Do you want to guess how successful this has been? So 2005, many smart people have implemented some brilliant solutions and studied them between now and then. And I won't critique all the literature, but if you're a pessimist, this is how you interpret it, with a quote sort of like, physician raters are impervious to training, or some raters are inherently consistent and others less so. The former do not need training, the latter are not improved by training. These are older quotes. I don't think we could get away with saying that these days, but it does capture some of the sentiment that remains today. An optimist might critique the literature and say that it's inconclusive for how effective rater training and faculty development is for this purpose of trying to decrease variability in assessment rating. This was a bit heartbreaking to me early on. I felt like that this is how I was going to solve this problem. When I was interested in variability, I'm like, hey, my background, I'm pretty good at convincing people to do things they don't want to do. Eat your vegetables, exercise. But if this was truly the overarching problem of variability in rating, the problem would have been solved at that point. We were missing something, and I couldn't just focus on designing the holy grail of rater training programs. So some of us started looking at what else is going on? What else is contributing to this variability that seems to be resistant to convincing people to rate the way they're supposed to? One of our recent ideas was we looked around. We spent a lot of time describing competence. We have elaborate frameworks on competence, but we don't talk much about incompetence. Like, well, maybe we just don't have the right language around it. It's left a bit unsaid. If we specified it a bit better, it would help people to document it better. So we went to the literature and said, well, how is incompetence being described there? And we found kind of three different ways that it was alluded to. One is that it's the opposite of competence. So that would use words like inability or unprofessional. So you describe what competence is. If it's not that, then it must be incompetence. There was the idea that competence was gaining or growing competence over time. So then incompetence was that you didn't have enough of it. So words like lack or insufficient would be incompetence. Then there was more rarely this idea that there's different stages that you move through, and that each stage has a different kind of behavior associated with it. So a novice would be doing something different than what a skilled person would be doing, which would be different from what an expert did. So incompetence would be performing at that more junior level at a time when you should be performing at a more sophisticated level. So for our research, like, okay, well, that's 3 different conceptualizations right there. We don't use them purposefully in assessment forms. What if as assessment designers, we're conceptualizing it differently than how people who are filling it out are conceptualizing it, and that misalignment's making it difficult to document. So we went and we asked 22 physicians and asked them to describe their experiences of working with trainees who may be demonstrating incompetence. We wanted to look within those descriptions for what language was being used and how incompetence was being conceptualized. And we used constructivist grounded theory for this, so a qualitative methodology. Very clearly and very early on, we learned that incompetence is the wrong word. So the wrong word for trainees who are learning, who weren't meant to have known it in the first place, that it was too strong of a word for trainees, and that it could actually be harmful to label it in that way when you want them to continue to learn. This is a quote from one of our participants that I think captured the overall sentiment about the wrongness of incompetence as a label. So just because somebody's not clever, you don't call them stupid. So we're like, okay, not incompetence. Actually, competence wasn't really the right word either for what we were seeing for how learning in medicine was being described. Instead, what we saw is this strong-held belief that trainees are good learners, that they've been carefully selected into the program, either medical school or into the residency program, because we asked about both, that they've been able to learn to get there, that they're intelligent people. They were expected to show up prepared to learn and then to engage in learning. So they would be expected to come to a learning experience, get some teaching learning feedback from that experience, and then apply it the next time, over and over again. Take that next little bit of teaching and learning, apply it to the next experience, cycle over and over and over again. And as they were doing that, their skills would move from this more basic, rudimentary, crude version of what it was to perform clinical skills to a more sophisticated version. The simple belief that trainees should be good learners meant that when a trainee was in front of a supervisor and it appeared that they weren't learning, it was perplexing, confusing. We're calling it disbelief. It was almost unbelievable that they could have someone in front of them who wasn't engaging with learning. And this period of bafflement, we liken to the idea of black swans, even, that it's so rare that someone would be like this, that it shouldn't even be possible that someone could be not learning. And we can compare it to cognitive dissonance, a type called failed prophecy, for example. It's just this, that the bewilderment delayed being able to identify trainees that were in difficulty. It took more time. You need to collect more evidence to be like, is this really what's going on? Like maybe my instructions were unclear, or maybe like all of these other things, explanations for what could be going on, until it got to a point where, it's either not underperforming, there is something else going on, or it's underperformance. When underperforming trainees were described, there was 2 different ways that we could group those descriptions. One were the trainees who were unable to engage with learning. So this was noted when progression was stalling or stalled. So they were at a more rudimentary level than what they should be at, or they were unable to apply learning into that next clinical experience, even though they had been given multiple opportunities, extra feedback, extra everything. They couldn't apply it so that they could progress. Being unable to engage with learning tended to be attributed to a learning disorder, to things happening in their life at that point that was distracting them for learning, that could be dealt with, childcare issues, for example. It was sometimes attributed to medical issues that were going on, or mental health struggles, especially mood disorders, were brought up as possibilities for why a trainee wasn't able to engage with learning as they're expected to. Unwilling to engage with learning had a different tone to it. So this was more of a problematic progression because there was a sense of that the trainees were there, but not willing to engage with the process to learn and were progressing anyway. There were a few different ways this was described. Least concerning were trainees who were disinterested in the current place they were at. We had lots of physicians who described that they did maternity care, for example, and they had trainees who had no intentions of ever doing maternity care later on. So they were less engaged with that content, which was fine, as long as it wasn't negatively impacting the patient or the team or things like that. So underperforming when it started to cause problems at that clinic. A bit more concerning were trainees where it was felt like they lacked the insight to recognize that they were being given feedback and needed to take it and do something with it. More concerning because people described not really knowing how to help someone increase their insight. So again, kind of a bit of that disbelief, bewilderment of what do you do when you keep telling somebody to learn and they don't get that they need to do something with it. Most concerning were trainees where it was thought that they had actively decided not to learn at that time. So these were trainees who might correct their supervisor in front of patients. And that sort of behavior was attributed to things like being overconfident, arrogance, personality disorders, that sort of thing. It was often seen as a dangerous behavior because supervisors were concerned that those trainees wouldn't ask for help when they needed it and would end up outside of their scope. So through that research, we've gotten some insights into failure to fail. So we've identified this, what we're calling this disbelief phase early on that hadn't been described before, that delays identification of underperforming trainees. And that's a problem in how our programs are often designed because it's such a short amount of time that trainees can spend with supervisors that there were times where people felt like they didn't have enough chance to see what was really going on, to know what was going on. And when they did know what was going on, it's very difficult to be able to write it down properly. So these trainees could progress through the program for a while because of those short rotations. We also saw that in that progression, there was an acceptance that trainees would progress at different rates. So it was pretty much understood that most trainees were stellar and progressed quite quickly and had a very steep trajectory, but that there would be some trainees who would take longer, and those taking longer were considered to be underperforming. It's just that they needed more they would need more experiences, they would need more teaching, it might be more work. Sometimes, you know, it was the type of challenging that supervisors didn't particularly love being involved with because it did take more time, but they weren't considered underperforming. And yet those trainees, because they weren't underperforming, they would never even consider them for saying that they were below expectations because they were still making progress. And yet those are trainees who could probably benefit from some formal support, and it wasn't being documented. So one of the things we do moving forward is how do we identify those trainees differently from these underperforming ones that were really concerning so that we can get them the extra support officially instead of it having be done on the fly. Also, the failure to fail solutions have been targeting that classic failure to fail phenomenon, which happens after trainees are identified as underperforming. So to get some traction, we can try to start targeting before that. So of course, failure to fail is targeting the trainees that are the least competent, and they are rare, but the variability ratings happen for trainees of all different performance levels, and it's enough variability that it makes it difficult to feel confident in assessment decisions that we make for trainees, and it causes problems for analyzing assessments and then defending decisions that are happening. So I'll spend some time talking about just how variable these ratings can be, because I'm sure you're wondering, like, how bad is it? This is one of the videos that I've used multiple times. It was designed by one of my colleagues at UPenn. She's used it multiple times, and based on cases from Drexler, so used in faculty development, and the ratings tend to turn out like this. So this isn't just me and the people I recruited. This range of ratings is typical for this performance. So it was scripted to be kind of a good performance, not perfect. She makes a few little errors and omissions. And this is using a mini CEX. So I'm going to use this a few different times. So I'll just kind of point out the mini CEX. So it's a 9-point scale. The lower numbers, 1 to 3, are unsatisfactory. It's really considered failing. Then we have satisfactory and superior. So for this trainee, 5 physicians rated her as failing, even though most people gave her a 7, which is the low end of superior. That one's actually not too bad. This video I've also used multiple times, and it always uses all 9 points of the scale. So you can see if you were in charge of collecting these and telling patients, is this person competent enough to be in independent practice? It's like, it depends. It depends. We have ratings from 1 to 9 on a 9-point scale. Of course, we don't base it on one assessment form. We have a collection of them, but when they all have this kind of variability, you can see how you have this feeling of we need to do something better to make it more trustworthy. So I think you can do as well as this. I want you to try rating one of the videos that I use. We'll see if we can get it to work. I might need help to get it to work. But first of all, memorize the scale. So it's a 9-point scale, unsatisfactory for the first 3, satisfactory for the middle 3, superior for the top. I want you to commit to a rating, and there's no stakes attached to this, so it'll just be for fun.
I had a cough now for at least 2 weeks. It doesn't seem to go away, and there are times when I feel short of breath, which really has me worried. Are you bringing up anything with the cough? Yeah, I started to cough up some phlegm about 2 weeks ago. What's the phlegm over? It's just weird. Is it short of breath? Yeah. When you notice that? I get short of breath like after I walk up the stairs or when I exercise. Can you make it up a whole flight of stairs? No, I haven't. And what type of exercise are you talking about? Well, I used to use Stairmaster 3 times a week. Any checking? I don't have pain, but I get like a tightness in my chest when I get short of breath. Does it make you deep breath? No. Have you noticed any breathing?
Okay, so I realize that's a short clip, but it goes on like that. If you can imagine more questions in that stuff. It did move forward. Perfect. What are your ratings? I'm gonna keep track here. So who, and if people on the phone, if they can jump in, if you want to jump in and give your rating, go ahead. So who gave it a 1? No one. Who gave it a 2? A 3? 2 people gave it a 3? A 4? 5 people gave it a 4. A 5? 6? I think we just spoke out everyone. 7? 8? 9? Okay, so we have most people giving it a 4, and then we have some 3s and 5s. I will reveal the answer. This is what physicians in BC and the Toronto area gave this video as part of one of the studies. You can see most people gave it a 3, some gave it a 5. There's a spread from 1 to 7 on the 9-point scale. Okay, that's quite variable. Again, this video has been used in other studies, and this fits. That range is fairly typical. One of the criticisms of the study was that we use regular old people who do this as part of their everyday life in assessing residents, and are probably assessing residents right now, but they weren't experts. So we went and we recruited the experts, and their ratings are a bit better, but they look quite similar, and that most people gave it a 3, most people gave it a 5, which is a problem because that meant half of them said it was a failing performance, half said it was a pass, and these are the people who I would have gone to. So these are people who have written about assessment, they have textbooks on assessment, they speak about assessment. They're the people I would go to say, what is the correct answer for this performance? So we So we saw that there's variability there, but we've known that for a while, and that wasn't enough. We wanted to be like, where is this coming from? And that's where the rater cognition aspect came in. So when we look at ratings and use something like generalizability theory, which splits up where is all the variability coming from, the biggest chunk or the second biggest chunk is attributed to the rater themselves. So we wanted to look at the cognition, the thinking, the what's going on. As I said in the beginning or earlier, a lot of the solutions focus on helping raters be trained better, through, drawing on behaviorist kind of theories, the idea that if you had that holy grail of rater training, that there would be less variability. More recently, there's the idea that our raters are human. We're limited by human cognition, that we don't have perfect memories, our attention isn't perfect, we might focus on different things, so that some of the variability is inevitable, but we need to accommodate it somehow. Both of those see variability as something to get rid of. There's a mistake, that it's an error. So there was a few of us at that time who were looking at our analysis and seeing that in that variability there was some legitimacy. There was some assessment information that seemed to be useful, and we wanted to better understand that. So these are the ratings from the experts. And for this study, we used Q methodology, which allowed us to quantify the subjectivity. So it gave us a different perspectives, the different points of view that there were when assessing that performance. And they identified two different points of view. One, we called diligent competence, which was that she was sacrificing warmth for the sake of efficiency. That the short questions were, most of the right questions in the right order, just not all that warm. They tended to give a rating of 5, a passing rating. The people who characterized that question asking as not asking all of the right questions and doing so in such a cold way that she couldn't possibly get all the information that she needed and wasn't establishing good rapport with the patient, which made it more of a rating of 3. So when we could identify that there were these two different points of view, the ratings made a lot more sense, and it explained a lot of the variability that was in the ratings. In the previous study, we used lane partition analysis, so a different kind of analysis that we found essentially the same two perspectives, and the averages for those two groups were the same across the two studies, which was surprising. What I saw with those points of view is that it really wasn't that one was obviously wrong and one was much more correct, that we wanted to convince some people that they needed to rate it as a 5 or they needed to rate it as a 3. Both of them had assessment information that would help that trainee, that could help them improve in the way they interacted with patients and their clinical reasoning. So it was more the sense that there's something more going on. You might be wondering, is this only in medical education, this type of variability? And it's not. So this line of research was actually based on social cognition research and a type of impression formation called person models. So it's the idea that we form an impression of someone else by taking some key aspects and then forming a coherent story to explain why they're behaving the way that they are. So I'll quickly explain that study. So they had people watch a video of someone interacting with someone else, and then they wrote a description of the target person. They put those descriptions together using different analysis than what we used, and they found 3 different descriptions for each person, each target person. And those descriptions were sometimes so different, it sounded like they were describing 3 different people. So I just kind of highlighted some key words here, but this video happened to have a majority description, and that wasn't true for all of the videos that they used. But one, she's friendly, she enjoys talking to others. Then there was people who were like, oh, she's insecure and nervous. And then the last one, she's rude and obnoxious, she barely lets her friends talk. So that idea of talking a lot, I'm guessing, I didn't see the video, but the idea that she was talking a lot in the video, some people interpret it as that's her being friendly, enjoying talking, and other people interpret it as she was self-centered, barely let her friend talk. So now we knew there's variability. We had replicated something that was happening in social impressions in the medical education context. But we still don't have a good sense of why would people pick out different things as important within a performance and then build a different story around them. How do you get these different interpretations? So Peter and Yates and I tried to take this on. We both did our PhDs at about the same time. And he drew on social psychology research, so he's part of that Rader's fallible group who are looking at the limitations of human cognition, and our work got mixed up all the time. So we're like, oh, we might as well just do a study together. They don't have to worry about keeping our stuff straight. His entire PhD was a series of experiments that show contrast effects. So if someone assessed a borderline performance first, they would give it a certain rating. If they assessed that borderline performance after having just assessed a good performance, their ratings were lower. So it contrasted away from the valence of the performance of the first one. So I'll try to explain it. So if they're assessing a good performance, and that was the first one they did, they might give it a 7. If they assessed it immediately after a poor performance, they might give it a 9. Okay? So we took his data set where we knew this was happening. It was already in the data. We knew people were rating differently. And then we used the latent partition analysis I had used earlier. So we wanted to see, does contrast effects also apply to these ideas of different interpretations, different impressions? I'm going to choose a borderline performance because it was similar to the one that you assessed. Not the same video, but a similar style of video. And so 3 different interpretations. One was kind of constructive feedback, so suggesting that she use more open questions at the beginning and then narrow down to closed questions. The second one framed it more negatively, so pointing out that there's too many closed questions and the structure was poor and that it kind of came across as condescending. And then slightly fewer people had a more neutral version, although it was the most positive of the 3, and that's that those short questions were, efficient, succinct, detailed, relevant, that sort of thing. But what we really wanted to know was if there was a difference when the video was assessed first or when it was assessed after the good video. So remember, after the good video, they gave lower ratings. So for that constructive criticism one, the same proportion of people made those comments that could be grouped into there. But for that more negative one, almost twice as many people described it in that more negative way when they were assessing the borderline video after a good video. And then only one person did that most positive neutral way when they assessed it after the good video. So the good video had the right use of open questions and the right balance of open and closed questions. So what we're thinking is that made the use of the closed questions more salient, and so it became more prominent in their impression and interpretation. And of course, there could be other factors that would influence that. This was just the one that we could isolate in that study, but we can imagine that there are multiple things that might change the way someone would interpret the same aspects of the performance or pick out different aspects. So across this research and some of the research that I haven't had time to discuss, to me, it looks more like we have some people who look at a performance and then describe it as an old woman making duck shadow puppets, and some are described as a young woman making rabbit shadow puppets. And when you look at those two, you're like, both of those cannot possibly be true. Someone must be wrong. It's too variable. But when we look a little bit closer, it's more that it's a partial representation that's incomplete, but both of those are relevant. It's focusing on something that's in that performance, and that if we could collect it in a different way, we could be able to make use of it. So my plan was to touch on a few different things within medical education research to give you a sense of the types of methods and methodologies that can be used, how eclectic that it can be, and some of the topics that we study here but are relevant outside of medical education. You may be wondering what we do next after I get this kind of negative view of rater-based assessments. I guess part of it is that for the foreseeable future, we need to use rater-based assessments. They get at information that we cannot yet get at through artificial intelligence or through machines. So we need to make sure that we've got good use of them and that we're accommodating some of the limitations that we have. And I didn't want to terrify you about the quality of healthcare professionals or our training programs. That part of the privilege of being a self-regulating profession is that we're obligated to take a look at what we're doing and to make it better. And there are really sweeping changes in terms of assessment and curriculum all across North America right now. So I picked a few that came to mind that radically change how we assess, how we collect information, how we make decisions on that information. So there was a lot of people doing a lot of work to improve what's happening with our trainees and the decisions we make based on it. So I'm going to end there and open it up to any of the possibilities of what you want to talk about for the next little while. So thanks again for coming.
Are there any questions?
Hey, Sean.
Andrea, I'm wondering why we don't use a 9-point scale in our WBA.
Why don't we have a 9-point scale? Because you like it better, or?
Because we do a lot of them, and it would allow us to average, even though the distribution is kind of wild. But I do wonder when we just have flag or not flag, if having an average of numbers would be better. I don't know if you know the answer to that, but I'm curious.
Yeah. There's been a move away from having a lot of different points on the scale because they don't get used very well. So like it really just comes down to like what can people tell us in a consistent way, and often decisions maybe we'll do it pass or fail, or go no go, that sort of thing. So I think a lot of the change has come from that. You can average across it, and I think there are places where that would make sense. So one of the changes that I alluded to was the construct aligned scales. So we can use different scales. That mini CX scale is based on competence and the idea that we can measure it. And that if you have enough measurements from enough people in enough context, that all this variability will move into the background and we'll get closer and closer to the truth. Places where we can do that well are things like OSCEs, where we can control all the different variables and people can just focus on assessing, and we can standardize some of the things. It doesn't work great in the workplace where it's a bit messier. So there we've been, instead of trying to make the scale better, it's trying to align it better with what supervisors are doing. So this is where the idea of EPAs and entrustment-based scales came from, that what are supervisors doing in the workplace? They're deciding, how much can this trainee participate in this clinical activity safely and effectively? Let's get them to document that on a scale instead of how well they did it. And then we can average those. So those scales, Canada's using a 5-point scale in the new Competence by Design, and that can be averaged across. Family practice went a different way. They use feedback as their construct for scales. So they look at, like, well, what's a supervisor doing? Well, they're giving feedback. Well, let's collect the feedback that they're giving their trainees, and then we can rate it in terms of, I don't know, how serious is the feedback? What do you have to do with the feedback? Like, is it like stop what you're doing feedback, do something totally different, or is it you're doing well? I'm just putting, it's just a little bit of something. Keep doing what you're doing feedback, and we can monitor those and look for patterns. So I think there was a lot of work early on to try to get the perfect scale, but in situations where there's these multiple points of view, the right scale and taking the average might not give us better information. It's easier. And in the resident one that you guys rated, the average isn't a bad summary. Like a 4 isn't horrible when most people are saying 5 or 3, but in some of the videos, they're really different. And there's not an easy way to combine them to come up with a consensus point of view. So you would end up with a rating that was more reliable with that longer scale, but not necessarily better representing what was happening with the trainee in that context.
I have a question that I don't know really. You started your talk about in the context of medical education and well, they have a very complex environment in which physicians are expected to be doing all sorts of jobs at once.
Right.
So you talked about the influence of their perspective on a person, depending on when they see a good trainee or should look ahead. Have you ever been able to do a study where people looked at an assessment under different circumstances? So the number of, say, trainees that they have, or the intensity of their patient care that day. Because to me, I actually feel like probably would rate students differently on the noise that's happening around you. And I just wonder, like, it's obviously a very difficult, but does anybody talk about this variability of raters?
I not specifically like that I can recall. It certainly would influence, and the hope would be that if you had enough assessments for a trainee with different supervisors under different conditions, that variability that was attributable to all those extra things would fall away, and we'd end up with a better sense of what was happening. Where Peter has taken the work is he studies OSCEs. So in OSCE, you follow the same person through every station. So there's more of a cumulative effect of if you happen to be following someone who really makes some of your performance more salient, that could potentially be enough for a borderline trainee to push them over or push them under the pass-fail line in a way that doesn't reflect their competence. So he's tried looking at that, and he's tried looking at some stereotypes as well. His stereotype research didn't show as much of an effect as they thought they would find. He's based in the UK, and they anecdotally thought that they would see much more of an effect of the interaction between people of different ethnicities, but didn't. So I think it's, I think I would rather focus on trying to find a way of collecting and analyzing information that didn't fall apart so much when we had this variability, that could accommodate the variability better than what psychometrics can, which tends to be what we use. It's just that we really don't have something to compare it to of who else does that really well. So some of the programmatic assessments and some of the competency committees are trying to bring in different types of data, separate the judgment from the data collection. So instead of having someone in the moment deciding if it's good enough or pass-fail, remove that decision point and have a group of people who are analyzing multiple assessments make that judgment. But what you want is the data collected, the assessment data collected from people who are in the field. So that can help us know, give us a better, like field notes, that this is what actually was happening, and now we can compare it to standards and in a calm environment, make these really high impact, high stakes decisions.
I just raised it because we just had a case where the question is it something to do with this training environment versus something that is talking about a general efficiency process? And I think that because we put our training in very different, sure, day-to-day within a routine. Anyway, it's just an interesting thing to me that we end up having these same assessments, but the students are visiting very different. And, so while we're looking at these multiple assessments across a long time, they're very different environments.
Yeah, so it won't be standardized, which is one of the things that OSCEs were invented to do, that you would have trainees having the exact same level of encounter at the same time, same everything like that, to get rid of some of that noise. One of the things that there's the Coalition for Physician Enhancement. So it's a coalition of bodies in North America who look at fitness to practice of physicians. So I know one of the things they've talked about trying to do is to not feel like you have to make a decision based on the information you have. So setting things up that you can collect them, look at it, and then decide what information do you need to figure this out. So in a situation that you're like, maybe it's just that it's this particular specialties or this hospital, or they just happen to get all supervisors that are a certain style, then you could put them somewhere else and be like, okay, well, let's put them in the opposite and see how they perform, and then make a decision, and then collect more data, and then try to decide, but not making a decision until you feel like you have enough information from enough different places to be able to make a good decision. And some postgrad and undergrad systems are set up like that, but often logistics gets in the way, that you have the timeline just kind of comes up, and you have to make a decision at a certain point because the trainee needs to go somewhere else or not. You're left with this, you feel like you don't have the right data to be able to make the right decisions for certain trainees. Yeah, good.
Arm of that question.
video we watched.
Yeah.
I personally was like, oh, well, I'd like to fail them on their, like, person interactions, but I thought they did okay in the questions, but I don't really have any knowledge of that. So it seems like I was trying to base it on, like, well, what do I think is more important, asking the right questions or the person-to-person?
Right.
So if you break those two down in rating scales, and I'm sure there's lots of other aspects, do you find the same, like, rater variability is still really high?
So there can be. So the mini-CX itself has those other different dimensions that you would rate. I just didn't have you do it. You only did the overall. But at some point, you do have to kind of put those together somehow and decide, you know, what were her interpersonal skills so bad that it brings down her competence this far, type of thing. So that is where some of this variability comes from. That's like how like people can do that differently. We don't have a standardized way to make those decisions. We really do need humans to make those expert decisions. And it kind of depends. And you can see how some people with their variability, they're focusing on that particular encounter, which what the mini-CX are supposed to. So for them, they looked at that patient and like, it doesn't really seem to be bothering this patient. Like she's fairly good-mannered. She's not giving really short answers. So for her, it's okay. Other people are like, she's going to miss a major diagnosis with another patient if she does this. So they were doing it more on that predicting. So you could say, well, training could help make sure that you're focusing on what you need to. But yeah, we do find that those are kind of those two dimensions, that interpersonal skill, medical expertise, whatever you want to call it, can be at odds with each other. But even with those two, you can see in some of the studies where people interpreted it a little bit differently. In real life, it's nice to have variability in those because different patients want different things. So what could be too blunt of a style for some patients would be the perfect interpersonal skills for another. So I think we do need to have a bit of leeway of what's optimal. So it's like optimal for who, under what conditions. But yeah, you do point out a good source of variability. Julie?
It was very interesting because it gave me personal insight in your research, which I kind of discard.
I know it's weird that we know each other's research, but then we don't really know it.
Detail with it. When I saw the title, I assumed and go in the wrong direction often, that we hear about how you learn to fail. Because failure to fail. Which you kind of started off with all the medical errors. How to, is this the reason why because we don't fail students? There is a tradition in medical education that they, when you start the medical school, that you don't fail unless you die. There's a saying also. Do you think there's a need to fail for the society, health, or?
Yeah, so you're getting at a related issue. So failure to fail, as that phenomenon relates more to not assigning a failing rating when a failing rating is deserved. This idea of needing to fail, so sometimes called productive failure, learning under failure, is actually a hot topic right now. And the idea of that we can learn from mistakes, and how do supervisors make those decisions? How far will they let trainees go in doing something ineffectively or wrong, so that the trainee learns how to do it better the next time? And it seems to be, so a lot of it's been studied in surgery, a lot of it seems to be as long as the supervisor can fix it, they'll let them do it. So they don't want it to be major adverse harm to the patient, but they're kind of keeping it in that minor harm is okay if it's fixable. So it's controversial, right? So should we have no harm? Should we have, should it be zero? Should we make sure that no patients have longer hospital stays? Because So on a ward, instead of for surgery, on a ward, if they've been given too low of a dose of something, sometimes supervisors will let that happen for a bit so the trainee can see that it's not doing what needs to happen, and then you can increase the dose later. As long as it's something where they feel like it's not going to cause irreparable harm to the patient. But then we can put it in. So for the learning, yes, you probably do. Mistakes are salient. You're like, I'm never making that mistake again, or I see why. I thought that was the right dose. It's not. That we can move forward with it. But then if it's our loved one or us, we're like, I actually want the correct dose, the right surgery the first time. But then we get into situations where we have trainees who have never done a thing that they need to do as an independent practitioner in training because it's too rare or too dangerous. And it's always their supervisor who takes over and does the resuscitation. And all of a sudden they find themselves graduated and licensed, and they're the one in charge and haven't done it. So these are the tensions. So these are not simple answers. These are ones we need to be very careful and make sure that we're making informed decisions about how we're setting up our training programs and expectations for supervisors in trainees, and not having each person make their individual decisions, because they affect more than just the learning. They affect more than just the patient. Yeah.
Anything online? Great, well, thank you. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much.
I don't have to close it.